Good day. I'm Dr. Jansen, and today I'm going to present to you an article with the title, The Effect of the Absence of Gender Mainstreaming on the Persistence of Gender Blindness. The article was authored by me and Professor Vyas-Doorgapersad from the University of Johannesburg. Gender mainstreaming is a well-known concept and needs no introduction. It was adopted as a global strategy for gender equality in September 1995 at the Beijing Platform of Action. This is almost 31 years ago. The acceptance of gender mainstreaming as a strategy brought about excitement and hope for the achievement of gender equality, resulting in positive changes that peaked in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The positive changes in South Africa led to a progressive legislative and policy framework and increased political representation. This is, however, not sufficient, and the lack of effective implementation leads to a lack of meaningful impact on sustainable development. This presentation will focus on the interrelationship between gender mainstreaming and gender blindness, and then what we should do to ensure that gender mainstreaming is effectively implemented. The article adopted qualitative research methods. Information was compiled through a literature review process, and data was obtained through the analysis of relevant literature and documents as secondary data sources, whereafter it was analyzed through the conceptual and document analysis. Ample research is available, proving a deep interconnectedness between gender mainstreaming and gender blindness. Gender mainstreaming is intended to counteract gender blindness, but its ineffective implementation can actually reinforce gender blindness. The interrelationship can be described at the hand of 6 different categories, which will be discussed individually. At the most basic level, gender mainstreaming is an epistemic intervention, seeking to transform how knowledge about social reality is produced, validated, and operationalized with policymaking. However, gender mainstreaming does not automatically translate into increased incorporation of gender perspectives and outputs, which highlights the gap between formal commitments and epistemic transformation. One key mechanism through which this occurs is the illusion of inclusion. When gender mainstreaming is formally adopted, it creates the perception that gender has been adequately addressed, even when substantive integration is lacking. This can reduce the perceived need for further intervention, allowing gender blindness to persist. By treating all individuals as the same, gender-neutral policies fail to account for differences in roles, responsibilities, and access to resources. Neutrality is inherently gendered, as it reflects historically male-dominated institutional norms. In South Africa, this mechanism is particularly salient in economic and labor policies that prioritize formal employment without recognizing the gender distribution of unpaid care work. The absence of gender mainstreaming in such contexts lead to policies that are blind to the structural constraints faced by women, thereby reinforcing existing inequalities. When mainstreaming is reduced to compliance-driven activities such as checklisting and reporting, it loses its transformative capacity. Recent studies highlight how mainstreaming initiatives often become embedded with administrative routines without challenging underlying power relations. In such cases, gender is treated as a variable to be managed rather than a structural axis of inequality to be dismantled. The result is a paradox. The more mainstreaming is institutionalized in technocratic terms, the more likely it is to produce gender-blind outcomes. In the South African context, this is reflected in the high number of gender policies and frameworks that lacks effective implementation mechanisms. The presence of formal structures creates an illusion of progress, masking the persistence of gender blindness. The fragmentation of gender governance structures limits the integration of gender perspectives into core policy processes. Mainstreaming is most effective when it is embedded across all levels of governance, supported by institutional coordination and accountability mechanisms. In South Africa, fragmentation is a persistent issue. Gender units are often under-resourced and lack decision-making authority, resulting in their exclusion from strategic policy processes. This institutional marginalization reinforces gender blindness by limiting the visibility and influence of gender perspectives. The failure to integrate intersectionality into gender mainstreaming results in partial approaches to gender equality. There is growing recognition of the need to operationalize intersectionality within mainstreaming frameworks, yet implementation remains uneven. Without taking intersectionality into consideration, the impact of efforts to promote gender equality will be limited and could have a negative impact on the situation for some of the most disadvantaged women. Many mainstreaming initiatives adopt a narrow focus on gender, neglecting these intersections and thereby reinforcing exclusion. Gender-blind institutions are less likely to prioritize mainstreaming, and failed mainstreaming reinforces the invisibility of gender. This becomes a feedback loop where gender invisibility enables denial at policy level that again reinforces gender invisibility. This cyclical relationship creates a structural barrier to transformative change. When gender is not systematically integrated, inequalities persist. These findings support the argument that gender blindness in itself is reinforcing. Once embedded with institutional systems, it shaped both the design and the evaluation of policy, creating a cycle that is difficult to disrupt without deliberate and transformative intervention. The interrelationship between gender mainstreaming and gender blindness clearly indicates that gender blindness is not an accidental byproduct of policy failure, but a structurally produced outcome rooted in institutional, epistemic, and political dynamics. The consequences of gender blindness in policy making are significant, and gender-blind policies can reinforce existing inequalities, exclude women from access to resources and opportunities, and fail to address gender-specific needs and vulnerabilities. So what is the solution? The solution is that we need to refocus gender mainstreaming to break down gender blindness. Reinforcing gender mainstreaming will require a paradigmatic shift from viewing gender mainstreaming as a technical instrument to understanding it as a transformative project. This can be achieved by certain practices to be implemented. Re-politicization requires reasserting gender equality as a normative and political objective rather than a neutral administrative concern. This involves recognizing that gender inequality is rooted in power relations and cannot be addressed through technical tools alone. Policy processes must therefore create space for contestation, debate, and critical engagement with gendered power structures. This is especially important for South Africa, given the tendency to treat gender equality as a settled issue due to the country's progressive legal framework. Refocusing gender mainstreaming will require a need to move from fragmented to fully integrated approaches to counteract the fragmentation that leads to the marginalization of gender perspectives and reinforcement of gender blindness. Effective reform requires embedding gender mainstreaming across all levels and functions of governance, rather than confining it to specific units. In South Africa, strengthening accountability is particularly critical. While gender frameworks are extensive, enforcement mechanisms remain very weak. Without such accountability structures, gender mainstreaming will remain symbolic, allowing gender blindness to persist. Capacity constraints are a major barrier to effective mainstreaming, particularly in contexts where gender expertise is limited. Addressing this requires comprehensive training programs for policymakers and public officials, integration of this gender perspectives into data collection and statistical systems, and value community-based knowledge, particularly from marginalized groups. Breaking the feedback loop requires interventions at multiple levels simultaneously, rather than isolated policy changes. In the South African context, disrupting feedback loops requires sustained political commitment, adequate resourcing, and continuous engagement with civil society. To break the cycle between gender mainstreaming and gender blindness, a shift will have to take place to implement a suitable framework for gender mainstreaming that needs to be 1, politically grounded, 2, institutionally embedded, 3, epistemically inclusive, 4, intersectionally informed, as well as accountability driven. Such a model moves beyond the limitations of technocratic mainstreaming and provide a framework that address the structural roots of gender blindness. Addressing gender blindness require more than the formal adoption of a gender mainstreaming frameworks. It necessitates a fundamental transformation of institutional logics, epistemic practices, and power relations. Gender mainstreaming must be re-politicized, re-embedded with core governance processes, and reoriented towards intersectional and context-sensitive analysis. Without such a transformation, mainstreaming risks functioning as a legitimizing discourse that obscures rather than challenges inequality. Thank you for your time.